Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Climate Capacity webinar. This is the fourth in our series of 5 virtual grant writing trainings. So thank you all for being here. And if you've been following our series and have attended another training before today, welcome back. I see many, many familiar names in the participants list, which makes me very, very happy. Welcome back, everyone. And so I am the Climate and Disaster Resilience Manager at SoCal Grantmakers, and we are one of 3 philanthropy-serving organizations in the state of California. The other 2 include NorCal Grantmakers and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties, all of which belong to the Philanthropy California Alliance. Our work focuses on coordinating the philanthropic sector statewide to advance equity, racial and gender justice, build an inclusive multiracial democracy, to support climate and disaster resilience, and to bolster nonprofit sustainability. Our membership across our 3 organizations consists of over 600 foundations, corporate funders, philanthropic individuals and families, giving circles, and government agencies. And I'd like to acknowledge and introduce some of my team members in this alliance, some of whom are also in attendance today. We've got Kiran Kumar, who is the Director of Climate and Disaster Resilience at NorCal Grantmakers, Katie Oren, Climate and Disaster Resilience Manager at NorCal Grantmakers, Megan Thomas, President and CEO of Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial Counties, and Carla Mercado, the Director of Philanthropy California. Our partnership with the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, or Cal OES, is what makes these trainings possible. And the main purpose of these trainings is to build additional capacity for organizations just like yours, which serve frontline communities in times of crises, as well as during blue skies. Like many of you, we've been doing our best to track the unprecedented amount of federal funding becoming available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. And we hope that this moment is one in which philanthropy can support equitable investments in the capacity of communities to envision, plan, and implement projects led by people like yourselves, leaders of nonprofits, community-based organizations, tribes, and tribal organizations. And we've had the fortune of partnering with Gary Bess Associates to develop and implement these trainings for you. You may already know this because you're here, but just to reiterate, these trainings are all free of charge, and all of the recordings for our virtual trainings will be accessible online in both English and Spanish. And we'll also be doing in-person trainings through the end of 2024 in areas like Imperial County, the Inland Empire, Sacramento, Redding, Fresno, and more. I encourage you to visit our website and sign up for our newsletter to stay in touch and learn about future trainings. You can also book one-on-one appointments with the GBA team for direct assistance if you are working on a grant or would like to receive advice on how to assess a grant opportunity. So please use us as a resource. We want to be here for you. All right, so I was worried that the chat box would be a little cold, but it feels very warmed up, actually. Nonetheless, I do have a little bit of a warm-up exercise for you all, just to get everyone feeling comfortable using the chat box throughout the entire training. If you have any questions, if you want to interact with one another, or if you just want to introduce yourself to the rest of the group. We do download the chat, and there will be a transcript, so we can send out anything that is in the chat's transcript for you to follow up on after the fact. So with that, I have a few trivia questions for you to see how well you know California. We'll just go through a few of these to start. So feel free to use the chat box. It is multiple choice, so nothing too complicated. First question, true or false? California was the 10th state to join the Union. True or false? Okay, all right. I can't slip anything past you. Uh, you are correct. It is false. It was actually the 31st state to join the Union in the year of 1850. Great job, everyone. Okay, so next question. How many national parks can be found in the state of California? I'm going to give you three choices. Is it A, 20, B, 2, or C, 9? Okay, I see a healthy mix of C's and A's. Awesome. The correct answer was actually C. We have 9 national parks in the state, and California is home to the most national parks in the country. So hopefully you've visited at least one of them. All right, this one is a little bit topical and it's relevant to the reason why we're having this grant writing training. So, can you tell me which of the following hazards affect the state of California? I'm going to put the options here. They're A, wildfires, B, extreme heat, C, earthquakes, D, hurricanes, or E, all of the above. I see a lot of E's, one A, one D, A, B, C. Well, let me tell you, the good news is you're all correct. The actual correct answer was E, but if you answered any of these, you are also right because we are exposed to all of these hazards, which makes our work all the more important in this space. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you for playing. I feel like the chat box is very warmed up at this point. Please feel free to keep using it. Introduce yourself, your role. If you'd like to share contact information, you can. Like I said, we do save the chat and can share it after the event with everyone. Sarah, I will pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lily. Let me start by sharing today's slides. All right. This is Sarah speaking again, and I'm introducing our grant writing curriculum, the topics that we'll be learning about today. This is webinar 4 in a series of 5. On April 11th, we had a presentation on organizational capability and the statement of need. On April 25th, we talked about the program plan and funder searches. Today, we're talking about evaluation and logic models. We'll also be touching on goals and objectives because they play an important role in describing how a project will be evaluated and in creating a logic model. As you may recall, this slide that we show often at the beginning of our webinars shows the parts of a written grant proposal. We'll start by talking about how to write the evaluation section of a grant, where you describe the ways you'll collect data to measure what your project is accomplishing. Logic models may or may not be required in a proposal that you submit, but they're an important tool to design and to think through your project and evaluation activities. So we made a space to cover them by adding them off to the side here. We were interested to find, as all of you were registering for today's webinar, that this one got the most specific comments about what you wanted to learn from it, to build your skills around creating logic models, to learn how to use evaluation and program outcomes to document your good work in the community, and to leverage all these things to potentially win more funding. So we're glad to be presenting topics that you have so much interest in. Our first topic today is developing a data collection and performance measurement plan. These are the activities of evaluation in a grant project: collecting data, measuring performance, and having a plan to do it regularly. Our presenter is Jim Myers. He's the Director of Evaluation and Research at Gary Bess Associates, and he's been in this role for almost 25 years. He also teaches courses in evaluation and research methods at California State University, Chico. He keeps telling me not to talk him up too much, but honestly, he's just the right presenter for us today to make a potentially intimidating topic like evaluation become clear and practical and easier to understand in the context of a program. Jim, thank you so much for presenting to us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And I said, when we talked about, we'll see how I do, and maybe you want to thank me then, and maybe not. Anyways, yeah, again, my name is Jim Myers. I'm the head of evaluation and research at Gary Bess Associates. I live in Chico, California, just down the hill from Campfire. So this week I am out on the North Coast enjoying the nice weather. So next slide, please. So if you see on the top left of this slide, how to develop a data collection and measurement performance plan, this could be the heading on the several slides coming that will be coming forward. And you'll hear some terms, they may be loosely sort of used interconnectedly, like this data collection and performance measurement plan. You may hear me say evaluation plan or evaluation section. They're all sort of the same ilk. So I wouldn't get too caught up on the terminology and just sort of what you need to get into your plan. So the overview is, the federal and state funding sources typically have an evaluation plan that you have to develop. So, and most, private philanthropic organizations require also that folks be responsible for demonstrating progress towards meeting goals and objectives, and demonstrating project impact and outcomes. Again, depending on the funding source, there may be more that you may have to address, but these are typically key in almost any grant proposal you write. This process and commitment are often described in the evaluation section of a proposal. Next slide, please. So I think it's sort of addressed earlier on the previous slide that there may be variability in what is required to be written in a data collection and performance measurement plan, also known as an evaluation plan. Most proposals must clearly describe the process for demonstrating progress toward meeting goals and objectives and/or demonstrating project impact or outcomes. Are you getting the bang for the buck that the funder has allotted to you? So be prepared to address data collection and evaluation requirements in your proposal. Again, almost all grants, either federal, state, or philanthropies like foundations, require at least some coverage of what you will do with your evaluation and/or data collection plan. Next slide, please. So some considerations in developing a data collection and performance measurement plan. So this is, some things to think about before you start writing the section. Understand the proposed project. That may seem simple and straightforward. Sometimes we've seen evaluation plans sort of written separately from actually knowing the actual grant proposal. So you need to understand the proposed project. So we suggest that the proposed project for which funding is sought should be final or near final before attempting to develop data collection and performance measurement plan, right? You need a program, you need to understand it before you can write about how you will assess it. And you also need to be clear on the change that will result from your proposed intervention. Next slide, please. So some things we will be talking about throughout this presentation are goals and objectives. So as a starter, be well acquainted with the goals and objectives of the proposed project. The program design, which is how you're going to develop or where you're going to develop your evaluation plan or evaluation section. This is where you find that inspiration. So if you are writing the full proposal, you will likely be familiar with the goals and objectives. However, if you are just writing, says the program plan should be, say, maybe evaluation plan, it is important to you that you read the grant proposal and be clear on the goals and objectives of the grant. Next slide, please. So again, well, this is just a quick overview of goals and objectives with some examples. So goals are qualitative statements of what you ultimately hope to accomplish with your proposal. So it's what you want to do. So you usually don't have any numbers tied with it. It's just sort of an overarching end game where you want to see this project end. So for this case, we use having an escape plan in case of fire. So our goal is to ensure that every household in our community has an escape plan in case of a fire. Now, our objectives are quantifiable, meaning they can be measured. So now we have to take it to another level and actually say, what is the impact? And typically you have a numeric outcome with that. So one of the objectives that ties to goal number one is a minimum of 50% of households will report that they have discussed with family members an escape route in case of a wildfire. And then another objective, again, back to goal number one, is a minimum of 75 community residents will attend fire safe training meetings. So those are some examples of some goals and objectives that will likely find your way into your evaluation section or data and measurement plan. Next slide, please. So some things to be mindful when you're developing your, we'll just shorten it out, your evaluation plan. If the proposal has prompts, which it may, some are very prescriptive, funding sources are very prescriptive. If the proposal has prompts for the data collection and performance measurement plan, ensure that you have comprehensively responded to each of the prompts. Next slide, please. So another thing to know is when developing the evaluation narrative in your plan, ask the following questions or be thinking about them also. Is there enough staff to carry out the plan as designed? How will the data be collected and analyzed? Okay, these are sort of higher level ideas to be thinking about when you're developing the narrative. Does the data collection and performance measurement plan adequately track and or assess the anticipated impacts of the goals and objectives, right? So does it fit what you want to track or ultimately have as an outcome for all your work? Next slide, please. Again, when developing the plan, consider the following. If you do develop, I'm just going off here, track here a little bit. If you do develop, a plan, don't work alone if you can. Work as a team. So that's sort of the underlying takeaway from this. The data collection and performance measurement plan needs to be reviewed for buy-in from stakeholders of the plan approach. right? You're writing something that they're going to have to take on during the grant period. The project team should sign off on the approach. That would be key if you can. And then consider the plan as the contract with the funder regarding tracking and assessing project impact. So you're writing this, so you need to think about things like feasibility. Can you do it? Do you have the staffing? Those kinds of things. Next slide, please. As noted before, though there is variability of what is required in a data collection and performance measurement plan, that is, again, just going back to sort of interchangeably, the evaluation plan, depending on funding source and the complexity of the project, we would suggest being prepared to address the following prompts. Next slide, please. Be prepared to describe what data will be collected and at what intervals, or you could say what time periods. Describe who will be responsible for data collection and reporting, and also present the tasks associated with data collection and reporting. And we'll have some examples of that in the forthcoming slides. Describe how the data will be used to monitor and inform the project. Next slide, please. So now, looking specifically at what data will be collected and at what intervals. And this is, again, these are some suggested approaches with narrative to address some of these, address the three topics I just proposed or just shown in the previous slide. To describe the data that will be collected at what intervals, you may want to write something like this. And in this case, we followed it with a table to sort of make it easier for everybody to see how the connection, or the funder, how the connection of all the evaluation activities are connected. The team responsible for data collection and reporting will track the data in the table below, which is on the next slide. For each of the data points to be collected, the frequency of data collection, the source from which the data originates, and the frequency of the reporting is presented in the table. And we have a little asterisk there. And this approach is it really gives the funder an overview of what data are to be collected, how often it is collected, where the data comes from, and when the data are reported. Next slide, please. So this is an example of how you might put a table together to just sort of be able to easily describe your approach. So in this case, starting on the left-hand side, the data to be collected, in this case on the first row below it, number of fuel breaks developed with the targeted area. And said, okay, this is what we want to collect data on. And then the frequency we're going to collect it is every 3 months over the life of the grant. Again, this is sort of just sort of a made-up scenario, but just to sort of show you, I mean, just giving a very specific time frame that frequency of data will collect. You need the data sources to track number of fuel breaks developed, right, in the target area. So record tracking number of fuel breaks developed, pre and post documentation, maybe through photos or GIS mapping. It's showing areas that have been at baseline or pre-test, where you're going to, work, and then, sort of look at all the breaks that were created over the life of the grant. And in this case, we said, and you probably be directed by the funder how often that they would like reporting. In this case, it just, for example, said annually. And then another example below, data to be collected, number of community level wildfire prevention programs in the targeted area, for example, community chipping days and green waste bins. So frequency of data collecting around this. is every 3 months of the life of the grant. And the data sources will be records tracking the number of chipping days offered in the target area and green waste bins distributed in the targeted area, sorry. And then this frequency of reporting is annually. Again, these are fictitious. There could be more, or you could think of some better things to track. Next slide, please. Lots of text on this one. Sorry about that. Responsibility for data collection and reporting. So, you know, we say we're going to do some of this data collection, and it's not going to happen on its own. So, sort of being able to demonstrate who and what their task will be around data collection is important. So responsibility for data collection and reporting. To explain who is responsible for the data collection and reporting, you may wish to say something like this. The team responsible for data collection, you could say something else. It could be the evaluator or another, specific staff member. The team responsible for data collection and reporting, together with project staff, will develop a data collection plan to inform the project, which will include A, data collection protocols, which includes responsibilities, roles, and frequencies for data collection and reporting, and B, a list of data sources to be collecting for the project. The data collection plan will ensure progress towards the goals and objectives. These data will also help to refine the program by providing regular assessment of progress status on data collection, i.e., are we attaining our anticipated results? So that gives you just a nice little blurb about who is responsible, what data is going to be, the process for collecting data and reporting, and the overall reason for collecting data, which is, to help refine program by providing regular assessment of progress status. Next slide, please. So again, around the responsibility for data collection and reporting, you want to describe data collection processes and timelines. You may wish to say something like this. Data will be collected and analyzed on an ongoing basis with the timeliness and quality of data continuously assessed. If staff require additional training, the training will be provided by the team responsible for data collection and reporting. On a quarterly basis, data dashboard summaries, if people don't know what a data dashboard is, it's basically looking at your dash on a car and you have everything like gas, miles per hour, you have everything right in front of you. And so a data dashboard summarizes the same thing with the data you're collecting for your grant. On a quarterly basis, data dashboard summaries will be prepared to show the project's cumulative process reaching benchmarks, annual projections, and project objectives. These are some new words that will, or you may have already been introduced them in earlier sessions. So if not, though, we can definitely talk about these during the question and answer. Next slide, please. How data will be used to monitor and inform the project. Just going off script a little bit. You want to, if you can, continuously be collecting data throughout the grant. And so that when you come to the end, you may have missed something that could have been, enhanced, some part of the project that wasn't working, that you could have made modifications and then hopefully seen some better outcomes. So if you're continually collecting data, reporting it out, looking at what it's telling us, and then making any modifications to your project as needed, that is the best approach. And we talk about this in this one. So describe how data will be used over the course of your proposed program. You may wish to say something like this. I may have said that already. If I have, I'm sorry. A review of the data will regularly occur to inform the project team on progress toward a grant goals and objectives and anticipated outcomes. If the data suggests that goals and objectives are not being achieved as anticipated, the project will test new strategies to improve attainment of projected outcomes. And again, you may not have to, or you need to introduce sort of a model of quality improvement that you would like to implement. In this case, we said, okay, which is a widely used one, the PDSA model, plan, do, study, act, will be used continuously, uh, will be used to continuously review the project's progress and preliminary outcomes. So I think it's a strength if you have a model that you'll use for quality improvement. And there's an example of the PDSA model on the next slide. Next slide, please. So it's, again, plan, do, study, act, PDSA. So when we plan, we propose a change idea and how it will be tested, right? If we have, we're collecting data and we look at it and we see something's not quite as we would expect it, or and we suggest modifications we needed to be made, and we made those modifications. We propose that, and we test it, what we predict what will happen. And then we do, which we implement change idea, collect data, reflect on how well the plan was followed. Act, share final reflections, conclude whether to adopt, adapt, or abandon change idea, and then study, analyze data collected, compare results to predictions, captures learnings. I sort of stumbled through that again a little bit, but I think you can see it's just sort of, it is a cyclical process, and that anytime you want to make modifications, then you should do the PDSA or some like model. Next slide, please. This really comes to the end of my section, so I know we're going to go into question and answers and then take a break. But Brenda from our team, Brenda Freeman, will be piggybacking on this presentation in the second section of this webinar. So do we have, next slide, questions or answered, or question and answer on program evaluation? We went through a lot. Again, if the terminology seems a little fuzzy still, that's fine. Just the idea that we need to in the evaluation section, or data measurement plan, as it's called other things sometimes, we just need to be clear in how we propose, what we want to collect, how we propose collecting it, who collects it, and then how we're going to use that data to inform and improve our project. Any questions then?
So for our question and answer period, this is Sarah speaking again. Please go ahead, put questions or comments in the chat box. We can read them out from there, or else you can raise your hand electronically using the reaction button, and we'll spotlight you for the group. I'll invite you to unmute and share your questions or comments.
And I am pretty sure if you don't have questions now, you might have questions when you actually start getting into it. And again, as Sarah pointed out, we're part of the team that can help be a thought partner with you on maybe how you want to approach your evaluation plans.
That's true too. This is Sarah again. One piece I wanted to say about those very text-heavy slides that we saw going by and that Jim walked us through, that's actually example text from the type of evaluation section that Gary Bess Associates would write. And so it's all the language in the way that a funder wants to hear it. And so make sure that you download your copy of the slides and you have those that you can look back on that complex evaluation language as an example if you're writing something like this for yourself. There's a question from the chat box. Amber Chapman asks, does the definition for goals and objectives remain the same into the logic model?
That's a good question. I think that's a probably funder by funder um, um, uh, approach. You know, we have just one of the projects we're working on. Basically, the goals and objectives are looked at each year of the grant. Say it's a 5-year grant, and they may change over the time because you may change the way you're doing things, and so the things you want to track might change some. So I think it's just sort of how I think how the funder sees goals and objectives as something more stagnant or sort of organic and changing over time. At least that's my experience.
I could say, this is Sarah again, looking forward into the logic model section, we will see places in the logic model where you refer to an objective, and that's the same objectives that were identified during the evaluation plan. So at least for your internal planning purposes, it's a good idea to have a good level of alignment between all of those pieces.
Yeah, and again, it was in our presentation. This is Jim. I'm trying to get it, Sarah.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, if you shouldn't write alone. I mean, if you have your project team, they all need to be on board. You all need to understand what the proposed program is, because that's only then can you really write a nice, good local evaluation plan or data measurement plan. So it's key to know what you want to do and who's going to be part of it.
I have an example I want to share. This is Sarah speaking. One of the nicest evaluation conversations I was ever part of, and this was a conversation actually led by Brenda Freeman, who's presenting next. We were in a room talking with community members who were at the earliest stages of planning about a program. And the question was raised. Well, Brenda was responsible for raising the question early of, think about, as you're planning your program, what you need to measure along the way. So you can remember to have a sign-in sheet at your event if one of your objectives is how many people have attended a community event. In Jim's example, you need a record of how many people attended the community fire safe events, and you need to plan from the very beginning to have those records, ask those questions, record those numbers along the way. There's a question in the chat box from Janet Guan. For organizations that are smaller in budget, in staffing, how do you recommend starting to incorporate evaluation into programming? Great question, Janet. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Again, this is Jim. That is a good question. I don't know, and there's other Gary Bess Associate team members on here. I would ask if they could add if they would like. That is a good question, and yeah, you can. I would argue you probably have staff, or if you don't, we'll assume that you do. With some level of just nice organizational skills or analytic skills that we could we could probably, find within your organization. Again, if you're small and you're going after the grant and you feel well enough to, write it and write the evaluation section, or find some help for it, you could also perhaps write into your budgeting process is actually hiring an outside evaluator to help you do that. And we've done in the past where we've actually worked with some of our clients, which were, programs like you, where we not only do the evaluation, we also start teaching staff how to do some of it, because they may want to bring it in-house. And we've had that happen a couple times where we've actually put ourselves out of a job, which is fine. But the intent the whole time was to get them started, so they didn't miss anything around their reporting. And then do some training to do some lower level evaluation. We stuck around for some TA and some statistical analysis, but you could find there's usually a place in the budget for evaluation, so you may want to hire somebody if you feel you just don't have the bandwidth to do it, which is typically everybody. Hope that helps.
Let's see. We've got Gary Bess of Gary Bess Associates on the call, who is volunteering to have a go at answering that question as well. Gary, can you raise your hand or turn on your camera so we can find you, and then unmute and speak to the group, please?
I'm happy to.
Great.
Can you hear me okay,
Thanks.
Sarah? I
Yes.
think it's just want to say, I think it's a great question. We shouldn't discount our own expertise.
That's right.
And many of the applications that you're writing and that may have an evaluation component, in many ways, you're closest to the need and understanding of the need. And it doesn't necessarily have to be high science. You don't need statistics and so forth. But at minimum, in the intervention, whatever your program is that you're proposing, you can certainly count if there's an increase in number of people attending, or very basic survey where you would develop the survey and see if people agree with you that there's a need in this area, or that over time, if you do like, excuse me, do a survey at the beginning of the program, then at the end of the program, you might show that people have increased their knowledge, or are more supportive, or have better understanding. So, since you know the issues that you want to address, nothing precludes you from developing questions that can be answered. And the other side of it, we haven't talked about this, and I don't want to take too long, but there's different types of data to be collected. Some of it is quantitative, meaning numbers and so forth, but there's also qualitative data, meaning just listening to people and recording what they're telling you. And from that, sometimes themes emerge. In many ways, you become the computer. You're hearing from people and they're saying the same thing in a lot of different ways. You can record that too as an outcome, as something that has changed over time because people are more optimistic, more favorably disposed to a particular idea or intervention. So the point being is that you can use an evaluator. We make a living by doing it, but there's a lot of evaluation that you can incorporate that's homegrown within your own program.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary. This is Sarah. We're almost at the end of the Q&A period. I just want to say again and emphasize again the importance and the validity and the value of those measures that may seem very simple or basic. The number of people who came to an event, that's an easy thing to measure. And Gary was explaining the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. If you go back to the webinar from April 11th and you listen to the section on the statement of need, there's a very good explanation of the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And both of those are places to look, places to explore as you ask questions about what effect is our program having. You can measure it in both ways. Okay, that's the time we have for questions and answers for Jim. This will be our short break now. It will last for 5 minutes. During that time, we'll share a poll. So please take a look at the poll questions that we'll share onto the screen. And here they are now. There are 2 questions, so make sure that you scroll down in the box to see both of them. We'll review the group's answers when we get back, but your answers won't be visible as belonging to you. They'll only be combined with the whole group. And you'll see the questions. They're a bit humorous, so feel free to be as honest as you want in your answers. Enjoy your short break. I'll call you back when it's over. You'll hear me speaking. Thanks. Okay, everyone, it's time to be heading back, please. The main reason we have a midpoint break like this is to give our interpreter, Andrea Rochas, a little rest. Thank you, Andrea, for all that you're doing to make our webinars and curriculum accessible to Spanish speakers. As we're gathering again, I will ask that our poll answers be displayed. Okay, great. So even though these questions were informal and maybe a little humorous, we presented them in an evaluation style for you. So the first question was, after the presentation on evaluation, my knowledge and confidence in using evaluation concepts, 3 choices of answers, my knowledge and confidence increased, decreased, or stayed the same. I'm happy to notice that no one's knowledge and confidence decreased as a result of the presentation, and we have 69% who answered reported increased, and 31% of those who answered reported that they stayed the same. So, Lily, thank you for the laughter emoji. But I hope you noticed that these questions are reflecting a particular point in time. They ask you to look back, to self-reflect on the outcomes of the evaluation presentation for you. The second question asks you to look forward and describe how you're feeling before the logic models presentation. The question was, before the presentation on logic models, my feelings about creating a logic model are, and then there's a choice of options, a range of emotion words. This is qualitative data ranging from confident to neutral in the middle, down to uncertain, confused, and even repelled. We can see from the percentages of our answers, most of our respondents are clustered in the middle, interested, neutral, or uncertain. Right in the center, we've got some folks who are feeling confident, 7% of our answerers, and 6% at the other end of the scale feeling confused. This is our baseline measurement. It's a picture of where we're starting from as a group before we have received the presentation on logic models. This is an example of what we were talking about, that even simple questions and simple outcome measures can give us information about where we're started from and the effects that we're having. So thank you everyone for participating in that. Let's stop sharing. So this brings us to our second topic, logic models, an essential component for grant applications. Our presenter is Dr. Brenda Freeman, a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno, and a program evaluator. She's known for her love of logic models and her ability to teach them well and with enthusiasm, and we're so lucky to have her present for us today. Brenda, I'd like to turn it over to you. There you are. Great.
Thank you, Sarah. This is Brenda speaking. And first of all, I'd like to thank Gary Bess Associates, for the invitation to be here speaking with you today on a topic that I really do love. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. It's sometimes people look at evaluation topics and they think, oh, they're boring, or they think that's not for me because don't like to work with numbers, or they have these kinds of responses, emotional responses to evaluation. In fact, logic model building is something that I love because it's a team activity, something that we do together. It's something that helps us to have a shared vision for what our program's about. And it's also it's a mechanism to communicate with others about our program. So I'm very glad to be here, and I apologize in advance to those of you who are already confident and competent in logic models, because I based this presentation on a very beginning level of logic model building with the thought in mind that we'll want to usher more people into the space where we build logic models together. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the next 20 minutes, we have 3 goals. We're just going to learn a little bit about logic models and grant applications. And then we want to talk about logic model formats, because there isn't one right format. So we would like to discuss that for a moment. And then we'll do just a little bit of hands-on work with a logic model, giving you the opportunity to enhance that logic model that we have prepared. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'd like to thank those of you who, in your registration, made comments related to logic models, and I really appreciate that. And I'm sharing some that Sarah was kind enough to give to me. So upskilling in logic models, understanding them from a funder perspective, outputs versus outcome, thinking about how the program design fits with the specific outcomes, how to create a logic model, how to leverage logic models to make your case to the funder, and learning more about the development of logic models as a larger part of the evaluation effort that Jim spoke about. So we'll make sure that my presentation is not in this order by any means, but I think we're touching on most of these points. Next slide, please. Okay, so logic models in grant applications. Next slide, please. Okay, so the concept that's really important here in terms of the use of a logic model in a grant application is that the program, Jim made this point, I'd like to underscore the point, that the program is key to the logic model. And in fact, the Kellogg Foundation had on their website a phrase that said the bane of good evaluation is poor program design. Meaning your evaluation follows, it doesn't lead. Evaluation follows program design. And so if your program design, it's like the way it's the way I cook dinner, that my vision might be something like I'd like to make fettuccine Alfredo, but then we end up having macaroni and cheese. And so, I mean, part of what goes on there is that you've got this vision that's huge. And so, but if you don't take that vision for this like fancy dish and break it into parts, that is a program that is understandable, that has goals and objectives, that's clear, then it's going to be much more difficult for a funder to understand that program. So your logic model won't make any sense because your program hasn't been well planned, or your program is still at the large level where it's a dream, but it hasn't been translated into smaller steps or activities. So it needs to be just understood up front that it's a prerequisite to building an effective logic model is to have a very clear program design. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so a logic model, in terms of what a logic model is, you might view it as it's a visual explanation of a program, and it has all the critical information that a funder might need to take a look at your program just on one page. So they take a long time to write. It's true they take a long time to write because it's visual and often there's a fair amount of text in there. And some of the questions that might be addressed will be like, what do you hope to accomplish? How do you plan to accomplish it? How will you know if it's been accomplished? But what actually goes in there will be unique to your program. So unless the funder gives you a template for the logic model that they'd like you to use, there are some categories that we often see, like inputs, goals and objectives, activities, short, medium, and long-term outcomes. Those are some of the common types of categories that we see. But unless you're given a prescribed template, you can determine what that looks like. You may want to have a mission statement at the top of your logic model that gives the mission of your organization. You may want to have a box in your logic model that talks about the context of your organization or the target population that you serve. So those are decisions that you make based on your context and the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. Okay, so then there's this question. This is going to take, this might take you 4, 5, 6 hours. Do we have to do this? Do we have to have a logic model in a grant proposal? Well, as Sarah mentioned earlier, no, a private funder may or may not ask you for a logic model, but it's your benefit to include one. And so the reasoning behind that is the logic model will help the funder. If you think about it from a funder's point of view, they might have 50 applications in front of them, and they're trying to absorb and understand and make judgments about the worthiness of those applications. And so it's very helpful to the funder to be able to look at one page and get the overall gist of why you're asking for funding, what you hope to accomplish with the funding. And the logic model can do that, and that may save them reading 4 or 5 pages of narrative. Now, they may then go back later and look at your narrative with more care, but the logic model can give them a pivotal place to get a snapshot of what your plan is. It's also visual. And if you feel like it, you might put in the chat box whether or not you're a visual person. I personally am a visual person, and so it helps me to see work that's visual because I can understand it in a good way when it's visual. Let's see. Also, a logic model tends to be an opportunity to connect the program with the evaluation strategies. So it's not an evaluation document and it's not a program document. It's a document that connects the program with the evaluation. So that's an important part of that too. Let's see. And also the process of developing the logic model is a team process, which then, even if the funder doesn't ask you for a logic model, it will help get the team members on the same page. So as you go through the conversation, you're using the same language and you're thinking about the program in a similar way, and you're describing it to external stakeholders in a similar way. So there's a process evaluation aspect that's a huge benefit to developing a logic model together as a team. Yes, I'm agreeing, by the way, with Carrie, who's saying yes, the logic model definitely narrows in on a good program design will be reflected in the logic model. Thank you for that comment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so examples of logic model formats. As I indicated before, there really is no one right logic model format. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a sample, and you might consider this to be a bit of a typical logic model. Okay, and so you might have a category that's something akin to overall project goal, which, as Jim mentioned earlier, that's the broad goal of what you hope to accomplish by seeking the funding? What is it that you're hoping overall to accomplish? So it's usually written really easy to understand, very broad. Then the objectives related to the goal, they're usually measurable. Okay, so quantifiable, they're smaller, they're more easily understood, they're small chunks that are attainable. Okay, then you move to the activities, which addresses the question for each of the objectives. How are you going to accomplish the objective? So how are you going to get it done? And then the outcome, what do you really hope will occur? What change? How will I be different for having engaged in your program if it's an educational program? What change? How are you hoping to change my behavior? Are you trying to change my attitudes? Or how will your key stakeholder group, your target population, how will their behavior be different because of your work? And then how will you measure that? Now here I've really I've added this category, which is a little bit more like, it's a little bit more like a data collection plan, which is what Jim was talking about before. It's a little bit more like a data collection plan. But I put the question in here anyway, because I think it helps us to make the connections we'd like to make. So let's just take a second to make sure that we're clear on the difference between an organized program and a spontaneous activity. Okay, because sometimes we have funding and we say we're funding an activity, but if it's not a carefully planned activity, then it probably doesn't have a logic model associated with it. Like this last weekend, I went over to I drove from Reno. I live in Reno, Nevada. I went to Sacramento to run an errand, and I got stuck in Sacramento and had to spend the night because there was a weather problem. That's over the pass, so I couldn't get back to Reno. It was like 30 inches of snow. Okay, so that's very different than planning a day to go to, let's say that I'd like to go to the Redwoods. Okay, and then I've got this overall objective, but then I have these objectives. I need a cat sitter. I need to plan out the trip on Google Maps so I know how to get there. I need to make sure that I have enough time in a weekend to manage the trip. So then I've got objectives and activities and strategies. So for the cat sitter, I need to pay them. I need to hire them and have them hired 2 days in advance at least. And then the outcome, why do I want to take this trip? How will that impact me? Will I learn more? Do I want to journal on the way as my measurement method, what I already know about the Redwoods? And then journal afterwards, what new information or experiences I've had that I can add after the trip as a form of measurement. So an unplanned activity they can be wonderful, but they tend to be spontaneous, and they don't have the thought that goes into a planned activity that will be in a logic model. Next slide, please. So we usually write a logic model from left to right. So we'll start with the outcome, what you hope to accomplish. I didn't talk it through that way with you a moment ago, but usually we're looking at what outcome are you seeking? So the natural tendency with grant funding sometimes is to fund the activity, to say we want money to go put on programs to raise awareness about how to protect your homes from wildfire if you live in certain areas of Reno. Okay, to go for the activity. But really, what you're looking for is to go for the outcome first. Okay, and so some of the questions that might help you to design a logic model, and these are questions before you even get a table set up, might be just, I can imagine a whiteboard, or imagine that you're working with newsprint paper around the room with your team, and you're saying, okay, what's the situation in California? What's the situation in our catchment area that we're trying to address? And who is the population, the stakeholders or the target population that we would like to impact? Who are we trying to help? Okay, what kind of change do we want to bring about? What percent of change? What timeline are we on? And how will we know if we get there? So those are just some questions that you might start to help you brainstorm the information that could then end up in a logic model. Next slide, please. Okay, so, and Jim touched on this lightly, but I'd like to go into a little bit more depth on this for just a moment, which is the difference between an output and an outcome. Okay, and so an output tends to feel a little bit more like a frequency count in an activity. Okay, so an output might be the number of participants. So it's just a languaging issue. So an output might be that we raised awareness of 75 people in X amount of time. We raised their awareness about a certain issue of concern. Okay, but that's an output. It's not an outcome. It's telling you the number of people that you impacted. So it's important, but it's really talking about volume, right? It's talking about reach, how much you reached your audience. Also not an outcome, but an output or surveys that you've conducted. So you've conducted a survey, that's wonderful, but that's an output. It's not an outcome, it's an output. Another one that sometimes gets confused is participant satisfaction. So that's when you asked me if I liked it. Okay, I'm telling you, yes, I loved your webinar. I loved your program. I loved the activity that we engaged in the forest. But that's an output because it's how satisfied I was with it. It's not an outcome. An outcome is, did it change my behavior? So I might have enjoyed it, but it didn't make any difference in terms of my behavior. Okay, so that's it can be confusing, which is why I'm calling it to your attention. Okay, a funder would mostly, I think, prefer to see an outcome, but if you're not ready for one, it might not be reasonable to think that your program can bring about an outcome change. Maybe it's a young program, and that maybe for the amount of funding and what you're doing, that the first step in what you're doing is just output. It's like, we need to get people to the table. We need to raise awareness and in this number of people and such. And we don't know yet if it's going to translate into behavior change. Okay, so you'll want to think that through. And if you are doing outcome measurement, is it possible to actually measure the change? So a lot of times people in logic models programs for grant funding, they'll use knowledge surveys and they'll pre-test you to show that you don't know much about the topic. Then they'll deliver their program and they'll post-test to show that, okay, you've gained knowledge. So you've had a knowledge increase. That's an outcome knowledge increase. That works fine, but be a little careful about it because research has shown that X amount of time later, depending upon what the topic area is, that knowledge is lost. So I'm in higher education. About 90% of what we teach at the undergrad level is lost if it's not applied within X amount of years, because you just don't retain that kind of information. So be careful when you're doing outcome measurement to really think it through. And then the last point on this slide, and I better watch my time, the last point on this slide is theory of change. So why do you think this is going to work? Okay, so questioning your own assumptions. Okay, so basically it's an if-then assumption. So if we do X, if we do this, then we assume this outcome change. So let's just take education. If you're doing educational programming, if we raise awareness and educate people, then we'll see this kind of behavior change. And so if you take our Living with Fire program at UNR, I live on a sloped area, and I know because I've attended their program, I know that I need to trim the trees that are touching my house. Okay, I have the knowledge, but it hasn't translated into behavior change because I haven't had it done yet. Do you understand what I mean? So be careful about our if-then assumptions, because sometimes we assume that if people have more knowledge, they'll act on it. Okay, so I'm not saying they won't act on it. You all have knowledge in areas that I don't have any knowledge in around natural resources and such. I'm just saying, put the assumption out there and ask your team, why do we think this activity that we're engaging in is going to make a difference? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just, these are pictures. They're not real slides that I'm going to cover. This is just saying that you may have a logic model like this one that's primarily visual, that has inputs, wildfire simulations, and the outputs that's just visual. Okay, and that's fine. Next slide, please. Also, they may have cultural significance. And so from our indigenous communities, we have some lovely logic models that are really important, where they have connected in these communities symbols and cultural concepts to the work that's being done. And those are very impactful. These are just two examples of those, and these are perfectly legitimate and important logic models. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we'd like to do is just talk about a simple logic model for a program and what it would look like to work on to build a very simple logic model for a program. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so let's imagine that let's just imagine together that we are, and again, I apologize to those of you who know a lot about this topic. I don't. Okay, but let's imagine that we're trying to we have a program that we'd like to get some funding for, and it's called Living with Smoke. Okay, and so what we're trying to do is to work on the difference between wildlife smoke and prescribed fire smoke. I would like to help people to have a better understanding of the negative aspects, health consequences of exposure to smoke, and the health risks that have to do with fine particle matter. Okay, and so our team is writing a grant, and we'd like to do some educational interventions. Okay, and so basically there's strategies to help to protect from wildfire smoke. And so these are just a few of the strategies, and not much depth on this description here. But monitoring air quality could be one. What are some of the methods of reducing health impacts that we would want to talk about that? We want to talk about outdoor activities and what to do to protect yourself if you work outdoors and you don't have any choice but to be outdoors during times when there's a lot of smoke. Okay, and we might want to talk about air filters. Those would be examples of some of the educational activities that we could engage in for this program. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so some of what we've done is with help from Lily, who I really appreciate her work on this, we've put together a bit of a fairly simple example logic model that we'll show you, that we'll work on here together in a moment. But what would be helpful might be for you to think about, if this were your program, what might be the outcomes or the outputs, either one, what might they be? What would you be looking for? And how might we measure them? How would we know if you attained your goal? And how are you going to do these educational activities? I mean, we're looking at social marketing. Are we looking at going to certain types of fairs or community activities? How are we going to deliver the educational activities? What would that look like? And what would be our specific objectives? And working backwards across from left to right, what's our primary goal? What's our overall goal? Okay, so those are some questions to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's take a peek at this. Okay, so if our overall project goal, and I'm going to do this in reverse order, we're not going to go to the outcome first, we're going to go to the goal first, is to help frontline communities understand the dangers of smoke inhalation from wildfire. Let's say that's our living with smoke overall goal. Okay, and so think that through, because you may say, okay, let's look at that goal differently. You may have other ideas about how that could be worded or expanded. So what could be then some objectives? Maybe you've got 3 or 4 objectives. In the end, maybe we would have that many that relate to that overall goal. But an example of an objective might be to provide X amount of educational materials to X frontline communities on how to prevent or respond to wildfire smoke inhalation. Could be an example. That's a general objective, and that we would put in, say, the number of communities or the number of individuals that we're hoping, or the number of different types of educational materials that we might want to provide. And then an activity that could relate to that goal would be to build an inventory of ethnic media resources in key threshold languages in the affected areas. So to make sure that our materials, however we've decided in our activities and objectives to distribute this information, which is really important to figure out the strategies we want to use, but to make sure that they are sensitive to language and sensitive to the kinds of approach that we might use. The strategy should be appropriate for the target population as well. Okay, so then what might be an example outcome from that? So increased access to trusted messenger networks that reach affected communities. Okay, and so as we're talking here, we might think through, is that an output or is that an outcome? Is that an output or an outcome? And then the example is a tracking example in terms of how to measure it, would be to track the number of media campaigns completed in collaboration with ethnic media outlets by the end of the grant term. Okay, so with some help from you all, if we've got a few moments here, it would be good to have Sarah assist us and learn in the chat box any of the categories working across the top, comments that you would have about other objectives, perhaps, about outcome measures that could work for this type of a program, activities or strategies or measurement, any place you'd like to enter into this logic model with your ideas. Sarah, can I turn it back to you?
Yes. Thanks, Brenda. So we want a little bit of interactive discussion about this logic model. We'll do that now. We are getting close to the top of the half hour. And so we're going to spend the rest of our time discussing about this. There are some questions in the chat. We'll get back to those over email. So for now, let's ask the group how you would respond to, expand, modify the example that we've worked through here on the slide. In the chat box, Sarah Hubbard says, a project goal could be related to health outcomes.
It's a very good point.
And if you'd rather speak your answer than type it in the chat box, raise your hand and you'll have a chance to unmute and speak to the group. I'm not seeing more answers or thoughts or suggestions coming in the chat box right at the moment. and I'm aware that we're pressed for time right at this moment. Oh, here, one more. Maritza Duby Urubi says, as an activity, encourage community members to take a pledge to prevent wildfires. Another comment from Katie Oren is a goal could be to increase the awareness and comfortability with seeing smoke from prescribed fire, not as scary, but as helpful. Since we're at the half hour, I am going to read one more comment that just came in the chat box, and then we'll move towards closing. Luann Rocha says, offer trainings as an objective, and activity could be trainings in multiple languages. And Madeline Young says, measurement could be a reduced number of ER visits related to asthma. I can see the wheels are starting to turn and people are finding ways that this would, how the example can be played out across all these different categories. So thank you for that, folks. In consideration of our time, I need to move us towards closing. And I want to remind everyone that the webinars, today's and the others in this series, are part of a wider technical assistance program. It includes 7 more in-person trainings throughout the year across the state of California. And there are other resources like the ability to make a one-on-one technical assistance appointment with someone from Gary Bess Associates. So this is one place where if you have questions about developing an evaluation plan or distinguishing between goals and objectives and planning activities for your project, you can bring it to a technical assistance appointment with us. Visit our website at climatecapacity.philanthropyca.org to learn more about all of these things and to connect with any of the technical assistance that I've mentioned today. And finally, I want to place the survey, the response survey, the post-event survey in the chat box again right now, and ask you to click the link to open it or look for how it opens in a window in your web browser. Again, this is how we measure our outcomes and evaluate our program. So we're very grateful for any feedback that you're willing to provide. You know from what we've talked about in today's webinar how important that is. We hope that we'll see you next time in our last webinar in the grant writing series next week on May 14th. The topic is budgeting and partnerships. And recordings for all of these, the ones upcoming and the ones in the past, will be available soon on the Climate Capacity website. So I want to thank our presenters for the excellent information and thank all of you for your time, your attention, and for being here today. That's the conclusion of our webinar for now. You may disconnect whenever you're ready. Thank you.